unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. The Indian giant has arrived. That's the title of a recent opinion piece by banker Mohammed El-Erian and Nobel laureate Michael Spence on the state of the Indian economy. It seems wherever you turn these days, there are stories about India's status as the fastest growing major economy in the world. In fact, it's not a stretch to say that its growth rates remain the envy of both the developed and the developing world. But what is really happening under the hood? What are the opportunities for India in a world riven by conflict and technological disruption? And what challenges might it face as it tries to navigate these choppy waters? To talk about the nuts and bolts of the Indian economy, I'm joined on this week's show by the economist Pranjul Bhandari. Pranjul is the chief India and Indonesia economist at HSBC based in Singapore. Whether it is breaking down the latest GDP print, forecasting India's inflation dynamics, or dissecting India's annual budget, Pranjul is one of the sharpest and most prolific observers of the Indian economy. I am pleased to welcome her to the podcast. Pranjul, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks, Milan. Great to be here.
So I want to start with the kind of most headline of headline numbers, which of course is India's GDP growth rate. At 8.4%, the latest quarterly GDP growth print came in much higher than most people expected. Gross value added, or GVA, which is another critical metric economists look at, grew at a slower rate, 6.5%, which was more in line with expectations. So maybe this is sort of a good place to start. Pranjul, what explains the divergence between these two figures, and which one should we be paying more attention to?
That's right. Thanks, Milan. So obviously 8.4 is a very high number. It was much higher than what we had expected. What we had expected was closer to 6.5%. My sense is GVA is a better indicator of where growth is in the economy. The problem with GDP is that it includes GVA, but it also includes indirect tax growth, and then it subtracts subsidy growth. And what really happened was there was a big fall in subsidies in that quarter. Fertilizer subsidies fell 70% year on year. Food subsidy fell 20% year on year. And all of this just artificially bumped up the GDP number. Now, we've not really heard about this in other countries. And I think this is something very, India specific that happened. The way we do a lot of our national accounting is in cash terms. We account for the subsidy payment when we actually make the payment, not the quarter it's accrued for. So it all gets very lumped up in a few quarters. And I think that's exactly what happened and messed up the entire GDP print. So I would look at the GVA number. It grew at 6.5%. 6.5% is a good number given the global backdrop, with a lot of advanced economies not doing too well. So I think it's not 8.5, but 6.5 is still good.
I mean, one of the other criticisms of the GDP figures has been this question about the GDP deflator and how you factor in inflation. We don't have to get into the sort of nitty gritty, but I do want to ask you about inflation because headline inflation remains persistent at around 5%, according to the latest figures, which means, for those who have been following closely, inflation is still running above the Indian central bank's 4% inflation target. My question for you, Pranjul, is what accounts for the kind of persistence or the stickiness of inflation, and how does the Reserve Bank of India intend to address it?
Yeah, Milan, we also have to look at the bright side, which is that a year ago, inflation was 6.5%. So it's fallen from about 6.5 to 5. So, hopefully we're on the right track. But 5, as you said, is also a very high number. The target should be 4. So we need to create more disinflation going forward. Now, what's really happening? If you break down the headline inflation of 5%, it's basically split between food inflation of about 8% and core inflation, which is headline minus food and fuel, which is about 4%. So it's a very interesting time in the economy when core inflation, the part of inflation we've always grappled with, is actually at target. It's actually at 4%. And at a time when growth is very high. Generally, what happens in India is that whenever growth is north of 6%, we see core inflation galloping up. This is probably after many, many years I'm seeing growth being buoyant, but core inflation actually falling. It's a bit of a conundrum. It's a bit of a mystery. And I do think we should spend a couple of minutes on that. My sense is what's really going on is China exporting a lot of disinflation. If you look at export prices in China, they've really fallen. If you look at export volumes of China, they've risen. China is gaining global market share even now in many parts of the world. And I think India is actually importing some of this disinflation. And I think that's one of the drivers of core inflation being very low in India, despite growth being pretty high. The other reason I think core inflation is low is because of this rather K-shaped recovery. We're seeing services inflation being much lower than goods inflation in India. This is not the case in many other parts of the world. And my sense is that bottom of the pyramid only consumes services once their incomes rise to a certain level, which is not the case. And therefore, the demand for services is weak. And therefore, services inflation and core inflation is weak. So, this dynamic of China and this dynamic of K shaped recovery is keeping core inflation low. And that's one of the reasons why headline inflation has fallen over the last year. Now, the reason it still remains high is food. Food is a completely different animal. It's been a pretty unfortunate year of El Nino. We've had extremely erratic rains, reservoir levels are low. We had a very, weak rice production. Let's hope the winter production, wheat production is a bit better. We've not had the vegetable disinflation we generally see at this time of the year. Vegetable inflation is running 30% year on year. And that is really what is keeping inflation high. Can RBI do something about it? Honestly, not very much. When it's food inflation, you just need to wait for the next harvest and hope, it's not a bad one. But to be honest, what RBI can do is keep monetary policy tight so that the second round effects of food inflation are not very high. And I would say that broadly speaking, RBI is doing that. The fact that it's not really cutting rates is probably good, and I hope it continues to be that way for longer.
So, Pranjul, you alluded to things that the central bank can do, and I want to kind of shift the conversation to the government side. If you rewind the clock, go back to February 1st of this year, the government's recent budget continued, I would call it signature capital expenditure or CapEx push. It now stands at around 3.5% of GDP, give or take. And one of the things that you pointed out in analysis that you've done is it looks like the government has simultaneously boosted CapEx. It's managed to lower the fiscal deficit. It hasn't unduly added to inflation and at the same time protected growth. I mean, and this seems like, sweetness and light, right? Like motherhood and apple pie. It's managed to do everything you would want. How did it accomplish this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what's really happened is some magic in tax revenues. If you look at income tax, for example, it's about almost 1% of GDP higher than it was in the year right before pandemic, and that's a pretty sharp increase. At a time, it would have actually fallen in many other countries. And I think what's really happened here is these painful reforms that have been done for the last 2 decades, from GST to Aadhaar numbers, PAN card number, bringing it all together has, I think, improved tax compliance, in the economy, and we really saw the benefit of that in the pandemic period. So tax revenues increased, that was great, and then some sort of congratulations to the government as well, which increased capex. As in the past, the government has used a lot of the tax bounty only for increasing current expenditure subsidies. But this time, the government split it between current expenditure and capital expenditure. And that's why we saw, capex increase. So I think it's been good from that front. But a lot of challenges remain. We had this very high fiscal deficit in the pandemic years, which have been coming down since, but we need to drive it lower. As in, the last fiscal deficit number we have is 5.8% for the central government. And in the next 2 years, it needs to fall to about 4.5%. So there's a lot more consolidation that has to happen. And I think with every passing year, that will become a little harder.
So I want to point to one of the other challenges that you and your colleagues have highlighted, which is private consumption. The government's latest numbers project private consumption growth to be around 3% this fiscal year, which would be the lowest private consumption growth in about 2 decades, leaving, of course, the pandemic year aside. Um, I'm curious, Pranjul, how do you sort of understand or make sense of this kind of soft consumption that we see in India, right? I mean, there's so much exuberance right now about the Indian economy. This particular number seems to sort of stick out a bit like a sore thumb.
Yeah, exactly. So, look, I've looked at this very carefully. My sense is that the Central Statistics Office has underestimated private consumption. My sense is that private consumption numbers will be revised up in subsequent revisions. So, from about 3% growth now to around 5.5% growth. I say this because there are a lot more indicators of consumption I track which aren't doing that badly. Like, look at the imports of consumer durables. They're running at 60% higher than pre pandemic levels. That's a huge increase. Look at non mortgage personal loans. They're rising at about 20 to 25% year on year. Look at some data we get on personal services. They are growing at about 8 to 10% year on year. All of this doesn't make me think that consumption overall is growing at about 3%. But I do agree that within the consumption pie, there's a strong K-shaped recovery in which the mass market is weak, while the top of the pyramid is doing a lot more of the consumption, and we see that in a lot of the data we follow. Right, you look at the sales of personal vehicles far outstripping the sales of two wheelers. You look at the imports of consumer durables, which I alluded to, far outstripping the production of staples like toothbrush and soap and things like that. So there's definitely this K-shaped recovery going on in the economy, but the overall consumption number I think is higher than what the CSO has estimated.
So, Pranjal, could I just kind of push you a little bit on the idea of a K-shaped recovery, right? Because I think the basic premise is, look, the economy has recovered from the sort of, pandemic shock, plus, of course, the shocks that came earlier, the introduction of the goods and services tax, demonetization, other global headwinds could factor into that. But the recovery has been uneven, right? It's been pretty good for people who are higher up on the consumption pyramid. It's not been as good for people who are lower down. But some people have looked at the recent survey estimates on consumption in India and concluded actually things are pretty good. Poverty is down. We've overhyped or overblown this idea of a K-shaped recovery. What kind of gives you confidence that we are in fact seeing this kind of two-track recovery?
Yeah, well, it's the sort of data I mentioned, right? Like passenger vehicle versus two-wheeler, consumer durables versus consumer non-durables. The fact that services inflation is far lower than goods inflation in the economy. I think all of this sort of points to the K-shaped recovery that I'm talking about. Even if you look at the consumer surveys that you mentioned, over the last decade, the annual growth in consumption has been half of the annual growth in consumption in the decade prior, and my sense is a lot of this has to do with the disruption which the bottom of the pyramid, small firms, the agricultural sector has been facing over the last couple of years, and their consumption is just not picking up. So all the data I track does point towards a K-shaped recovery.
I want to ask you about what I think is one of the most interesting and intriguing puzzles that surround the Indian economy, and that is the puzzle of India's inward foreign direct investment, or FDI. I want to quote from a recent article that you authored in which you said, "There's a mystery afoot. India is rising on the world stage, and its engagement in terms of market share in global trade has also been on the rise. And yet, FDI into the economy has fallen recently. Generally, the two go hand in hand." Given India's continued strong growth performance, China's continued difficulties, many firms' stated desire to pursue a so-called China plus one strategy, right, to try to de-risk or deleverage from China, why is it that India hasn't seen more inward foreign direct investment?
Yeah, thanks for bringing this up because it's really been a mystery, and I've tried to look at this very closely. There are two things going on. One is gross FDI inflows have been weakening, and then the second is that the repatriation, the FDI which leaves the country has been rising. So the net FDI has really fallen. It's more than halved over the last year. But the reason why gross FDI is falling, is the bigger mystery of the two. And when I looked into this closely, I tracked this data called investment intentions by foreigners into India. What do MNCs want to put their money into when they invest in India? And my sense is there's a big shift in the frontiers. It's moving away from a lot of the pandemic time sectors like drugs and pharma, electronics, computer hardware, to more futuristic sectors like AI, semiconductors, EVs, data centers. So a lot more MNCs want to come to India, want to bring money into India, but in very different sectors from the past. And because these are such new sectors, my sense is that it's taking just some more time for all of this FDI to actually get realized. And my sense is that over time we will see the gross FDI number pick up. So that's one part. The other part is the repatriation. We're seeing a lot of FDI leave the country, and you can look at it in two ways. I think one interesting way to look at it is the fact that many PE firms, many VC firms who put money in India have finally got their exit and they are taking their money out, which is not a bad thing because it shows that the Indian economy is, the markets are deep and you can get an exit, you can take your money out, which actually increases the confidence to bring in money again in a new cycle. So my sense is putting all of this together, FDI numbers will hopefully increase over the next year or so.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. Could I just ask you about the role here of factor markets? Because you know better than most. One of the most common refrains of economists around the world who look at India is India needs to engage in land and labor reform such that it's easier for industry to acquire land and easier for them to hire and fire workers and to scale up. But yet recently we've seen a lot of announcements, whether it is what the state governments have done to attract Foxconn or Apple, or what the government has recently announced vis-a-vis Tesla in terms of slashing tariffs. To what extent do you think that these kind of factor market issues are binding constraints, or do you think actually India can kind of pick them off in ad hoc or sui generis ways that sort of diminish their importance?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It almost seems like we are choosing some sectors, right? Like from electronics to EVs, Tesla, Apple, semiconductors, and we're just making sure we're laying out the red carpet. We're making sure they work out. But if you look at the overall investment rate, of the private sector, particularly in things like machinery and equipment that talks about new capacity being installed, that is not really rising on the whole. And that is the difference, right? You can increase investment in a few chosen sectors, but to increase investment in a dramatic way across the economy, you need far more reforms to happen. Everything that you spoke about, land, labor, ease of doing business, but also things like power sector reforms, and then the harder stuff like judiciary and bureaucratic reforms. And my sense is until we get all of that sorted, we will probably see investment rise in only a few sectors which are being chosen to succeed.
So we'll come back to the reform bit at the end because it is something that I want to spend some time on. But before we go there, let me just shift our gaze from foreign investment to domestic investment. In recent years, it's kind of hard one loses count. There's but a litany of top government of India officials, including the finance minister herself, sitting before audiences of kind of the titans of industry, right? And beseeching them, imploring them to open up their pocketbooks, to start investing in the kind of Indian economy. I want to ask you whether or not the data you follow so closely shows any signs of kind of green shoots that point to a possible revival of domestic private investment.
Okay, so if you look at, you pointed out the consumption growth number to me, that was 3.5%, right? If in the same sort of data, you look at the investment number, it grew at a whopping 11%. So there seems to be some sort of increase in investment, but I would say look at it very carefully. Where is it really coming from? Is it private sector or is it public sector? Let's start with public sector. The general government, which is central government and state government combined, have increased their capex footprint. So they're building a lot more roads and railways than they ever were in the past. But on the other hand, the PSUs, the SOEs or public sector enterprises, whatever you call it, over the same period have actually cut down on capex. So if you add all of it up, general government and PSUs, the overall public investment thrust is not that high. So then it must be the private investment that's doing the magic. But even in private investment, when you break it down, and we have some very interesting breakdowns available, it's coming from dwellings and structures rather than from machinery and equipment. My sense is that dwellings and structures is some of this, national highway projects that we're doing, but also it's a lot of this real estate. There's a housing boom going on. It's all of that that's getting picked up. On the other hand, machinery and equipment is still weak. In fact, I would argue it's a bit weaker than pre-pandemic levels. So there you go. Investment numbers are high on the whole, but if you drill down, you see a lot of it coming from the housing boom that's going on right now, and not an addition to capacity in terms of more factories being built up. Now, is this good or bad? I would say it's good. It's good that at least we have this whole housing boom going on. I think housing is a great sector because it gets you a lot of these construction jobs. A lot of people in the farm sector who were struggling with El Nino were able to get alternate employment in construction sites. So I think that sort of was very helpful, and I'm glad that it exists. As in, it's better it exists than it does not. But hopefully, over time, it does also increase the whole machinery and equipment investment bit.
So there's a larger question, I think, in here as we kind of bring some of these threads together about the so-called Make in India strategy. And if you kind of look at the government's line of efforts, right, we've seen a big investment in PLIs or production-linked subsidies in a variety of sectors. But these subsidies or incentives coexist alongside historically higher tariff barriers. Obviously, a decision by the government to stay out of these large mega regional trade pacts like the Trans Pacific Partnership or the RCEP, in which China, of course, figures. So if we think about Make in India in the policy mix that's needed for that program or that ambition to succeed, what's missing? What are the missing ingredients that you think we're not seeing right now?
Yeah, first thing I think the government is learning by doing. It announced a whole lot of stuff, and then it gradually made a lot of changes to make sure that impediments are removed. So it's learning by doing. I think in the beginning, it had announced a lot of tariffs on many items. There were like about 30 to 40 new tariffs that were being announced every single year for several years. And at some point, the whole electronics industry complained that this entire PLI is not making sense because you've increased tariffs so much. And then the government actually cut down on those tariffs. So my sense is they're sort of like learning their lessons. Even in this year's budget, they did not increase tariff in any items. It was the first time in many years that it did not. So my sense is they're understanding, what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do. And I think the next thing they need to think carefully about is how do you deal with Chinese imports. Many of these PLI manufacturers, they want better access to imports from China, from technical assistance from China, which the government is not very open to. How it really changes its attitude there, I think will be very important for the PLI scheme to succeed. I don't expect anything in the next couple of months, but after elections, hopefully, they will rethink this carefully.
Do you sense some kind of shifting political thrust or conventional wisdom on the question of trade, right? It is notable that negotiators have been working both on the Indian side and the UK side on a potential FTA. Of course, India recently signed a sort of mini deal with Australia. There was the recently announced four-country deal with a group of European countries, including Switzerland, which packaged in that trade deal were some investment guarantees into India. Of course, the EU FTA is still looks like a distant dream, and a US India FTA isn't even anywhere close to being on the cards. But do you sense that there is some shift in the kind of Delhi consensus on trade?
Yes, I think so. I think, the government is sort of working hard with, friend shoring, near shoring. I think the one you missed was Middle East, where, there was this trade pact signed a few years ago, SEPA, and that was bolstered by this investment pact that was signed in February this year. So there, and, when we spoke about FDI, one thing I forgot to mention was I'm actually seeing a big shift in, the kind of FDI India is getting. It's a lot more from a few countries like the US and the Middle East, where the growth is about 60% per year. It's a lot more from sovereign wealth funds, and very weak from, for example, say, China, or some of the old destinations like even Singapore. So yes, I think our trade partners are changing, and the government is trying to cement deals wherever it can.
I want to ask you a bit on this whole question debate that it seems energizes a lot of people, which is on the kind of services versus manufacturing debate. You published a report last year in which you noted that, as per global experience, India's services exports have reached an important threshold from where growth then tends to be rapid going forward. Recently, there's been a renewed sort of debate about how to invest after the publication of the recent book by two people you know well, Raghuram Rajan, the former RBI governor, and economist Rohit Lamba, about where India should really kind of make its bets. Do you think that services in general can make up for the slack that we're seeing in manufacturing, particularly when it comes to the kind of age-old question of employment?
Look, we need to create at least 70 million new jobs in the next decade. Honestly, we need everything to work out: manufacturing, services, and agriculture. But, on the topic of services, yes, I think there's been a huge increase in this entire GCCs, global capability centers, in which multinational companies are setting up their captive service centers in India and doing a lot of services and jobs out of there, which earlier were, in advanced economies, were in the headquarters. So these range from legal, accounts, HR, R&D, design, and the list is only rising. And we can see this in the data. In the last 2 years, India has earned about 60 to 70 billion dollars more in terms of revenues from these professional services than ever before. My sense is these GCCs have added about 1.5 percentage points to India's GDP growth in the last 2 years. So this is a big sector. It's very important. And sometimes when I take a step back and I think why it seems like it's India's time now, and why wasn't it India's time about a decade or 2 decades ago, is because in the past, the world was still globalizing in goods trade. Right now, the world might be deglobalizing in goods trade if you look at trade volumes, but it continues to globalize in services trade. In fact, technology has made that possible. Pandemic has made it more acceptable for all of these tasks to be done from, a different center. And India is lucky that it's got both services and manufacturing in a sort of healthy mix in its GDP at this point of time. And I think that's really the winning formula of India. So I think services are very important. They'll get us a lot of jobs, and they'll get us a lot of growth, but we need much more. So we can't completely ignore manufacturing either.
Pranjul, I want to circle back to something that we discussed a little bit earlier on, but didn't have the chance to kind of dive into, and that is the question of the deficit. In November of last year, you had the following to say, and I just want to quote from what you wrote. Going back into history shows that one of India's best periods of fiscal consolidation was between 2001 and 2007. That's also the period when growth averaged a strong 7%. Alongside fast growth, a strong commitment to lowering the fiscal deficit will be equally, if not more important. So here we are in an era, not quite 7% growth, but 6.5 if you go by GVA, higher obviously if you go by the GDP print. Do you think that Delhi possesses this same kind of ardent commitment to lowering the fiscal deficit? Are we seeing signs of that today?
Yeah, look, I would say that if you look at the track record in the last 2 years, they've been promising some amount of fiscal consolidation per year, and they've been sticking to that, which is sort of very rare in India. So it seems like the commitment is there. But you also have to understand that it's going to get harder with every passing year to generate, further consolidation in the fiscal deficit. So in a way, you could say so far it was just easy because we had this tax bounty because of structural changes and a lot of the pandemic time excesses, like for example the food subsidy bill was slashed a little bit and that helped us. But going ahead, I think we'll just have to do reforms to create fiscal consolidation. We've been able to reform the indirect tax code with the GST, but we have to reform the direct tax code. In the past, that has not seen the light of the day. Let's see if that happens. We still have to do a lot more reforms in food and fertilizer subsidy bill that can be brought down quite a lot. That whole work has to be done. We can really increase our disinvestment, asset monetization, asset sales, something we failed in the past. So there's a lot that has to be done, but the harder stuff remains. And we'll have to just wait and watch what is done after elections.
So maybe this is a kind of a natural place to sort of conclude, and I think it's a nice segue from what you just said. Maybe ask you to kind of prioritize a little bit in a piece that you published in January 2024, which we'll link to. You had this to say. You said, if the reform cycle continues to pedal forward, India could grow 7.5% over the next decade, right? Which is, of course, a pretty monumental thing. There's a time for everyone. If it plays its cards well, now is the time for India, right? Which is a pretty optimistic statement, one that's sort of pregnant, I think, with a lot of hope. I want to ask you about the kind of specific reform measures the government needs to take, in your view, to ensure that this is not yet again another missed opportunity for India. Now, obviously, I'm sure the list would probably be very long, but if you had to kind of isolate, 2 or 3 or 4 things, what is it that you would try to push?
Yeah, if I can just quickly take a step back, I find a very clear distinction between new India and old India. And I'm simplifying a lot here. New India is all of these high tech sectors, GCCs, electronic manufacturing. It makes up 15% of GDP, but it's growing at 15% per year, and it creates 5% of India's jobs. So very small, but growing very rapidly, and really the driver of India's growth that we are seeing in the last couple of years. And then there is old India, which is 85% of GDP. It has all your small firms, it has agriculture, it has rural India, and that's been growing at a much smaller clip. My sense is that if it's only new India that continues to grow, we'll be able to see the 6.5% growth for the next couple of years, but we'll be stuck with 6.5% growth. I think much lower than what we are capable of. At some point, we need old India to rise as well, and that's the big challenge. If old India can rise, I think growth can go up to 7.5%. How can old India rise? One part is that new India pulls up old India, and we're seeing a bit of that. We're seeing things like fintech, agri-tech, which are giving access to credit to many small firms which didn't have credit access in the past. Agri-tech is coming out with new ways to make the agriculture sector more efficient. So all of that is going on. But I think eventually we need the government to step in with, a ton of reforms, all the things that have kept old India from growing. If you want me to give you a list, I would say some of the factor market reforms, for example, the power sector, land reforms, labor reforms, the overall ease of doing business reforms, will be very important. Fiscal reforms are very important. The direct tax code, subsidy reform for food and fertilizer, getting disinvestment out of the door. And then finally, the harder stuff, judiciary, bureaucratic, skilling, and education. So, I would put it down to these. It's a long list, but I think, it is possible. And if we can get it done, then we can grow by about 7.5% in the next decade.
Pranjul, let me just, ask you, I promise what is the final question, which is on agriculture, because we saw this government try to liberalize 3 critical agrarian laws. After passing those bills, of course, there was a pretty remarkable protest led by aggrieved farmers. The government agreed to roll those laws back. And many people who watch this space closely feel that, we're sort of at the standstill where there's a kind of delicate balance. There's a lot of tension, but not a lot of political appetite, I guess you could call it, to try to push forward in some way. Are there things that could be done on agriculture that maybe aren't as sweeping as top-down legal reform, legislated by Parliament, but maybe more bottom-up or targeted actions? I mean, what are the things that you think might constitute what we would call kind of low-hanging fruit on the kind of agrarian reform side?
Yeah, no, look, you're right in saying that the major 3 reforms have had a setback in agriculture. And, I hope that process of consultation continues on the sidelines. So, just like GST, in a couple of years, we can be hopeful that these happen again. But in the meantime, my sense is that many states are doing some interesting things, on agriculture, some very sort of local interventions, getting people to produce the right crops in the right places, doing better matching, of crops and soil quality. And then there's this entire agri-tech. I think sorting technology, drone technology, satellite imaging. I think all of that is providing a lot more information, which can be tailor-made, to farmers in small areas. And hopefully these also have, some big impact. In fact, a lot of people who go to rural India come back feeling quite energized when they think about what technology can do for agriculture, which reforms unfortunately haven't.
My guest on the show this week is the economist Pranjul Bhandari. She is the chief India and Indonesia economist at HSBC. I think she's shown all of us why she is such a sought-after and respected voice on all things related to the Indian economy. Pranjul, I know it's very late there in Singapore. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you for having me, Milan. It was great to chat with you.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.